Welcome to today's office hours. My name is Philippa Lamerton and I am the ACH lead for the Advanced Competence team. For anyone who hasn't attended an office hours before, these are sessions designed to be open discussions with IFS leadership where employees, customers and partners can ask questions directly. Last between 30 to 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A session at the end. Today, we are joined by Matt Smith, Global Chief Architect, who will be discussing helping customers achieve business outcomes, IFS Digital Business Value. Welcome, Matt. Thank you for joining, and over to you.
My pleasure. Well, thank you very much, Phil. And hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are around the world. I'm the Global Chief Architect here at IFS. My name's Matt Smith. Just before the weekend for many of us. So I've got a presentation to take you through, and I'm going to show you a little bit of software as well. This is a subject which I'm super passionate about, and that's achieving the proper business outcomes that you're trying to achieve with any of your change programs. I'm going to mix it up a little bit today. So I'm going to take you through some behavioral psychology, some science behind change programs and achieving the very best we can out of those change programs. So if you want to ask questions in the chat during the process that we go through here, that'd be great. But let's jump straight into it with a pretty straightforward question, which is around why do we need a business value driven project in the first place? I thought it'd be quite fun to point out a study that was done by McKinsey a number of years ago. It's one of my favorite studies. There are others, but this one here you can see in the bottom right there. If you just go onto Google and type McKinsey 5400, you'll find it. And they looked at 5,400 IT change projects, and they studied them. And they found that on average, so it's a bell curve, remember, so on average, some were better, some were worse, but most of those IT change projects went 45% over budget. Unfortunately, many of them went over time. The average was 7% over time. But most importantly, I guess, because you can wear projects that go a little bit over time, but if they deliver 56% less value than was predicted at the outset of the project, that's got a serious issue for that change project. So in the report, they uncovered what are the very best companies do in their change projects. And the very best, the far right of the bell curve, did these four things really, really well. And I just wanted to touch on them briefly. So from left to right, managing strategy and stakeholders. If I just bring up what these things achieve so you can read through them at your leisure. So firstly, proper strategic planning, determining your strategic goals, aligning the KPIs throughout the organization and making sure you engage the appropriate leadership. That doesn't mean just senior executives. That means line of business owners, heads of process, heads of supply chain, head of warehousing, etc., to make sure that you really understand what you're trying to achieve with this change project. The very best companies did that very well. Next along, around mastering technology and content, this really is a point in the report about don't start from scratch. If you can start from something, an accelerator, a blueprint, templates, understand your current state enough that you can then determine the future state and how you want to take that journey from A to B, so to speak, but do that with some kind of accelerator. The next two, building effective teams and excellent project delivery, are fairly straightforward. But there's a little bit of a nuance in the report if you get a chance to read it. So when you're building effective teams, if you're doing a very large change project, consider spending the first few days or a week doing team building exercises, for example. Nobody enjoys it, but it does help very much with the finger pointing if something has a little bit of a bump in the road in months to come. But importantly here and into the excelling at project delivery, scope management and recognizing that any change program was iterative, if done well, and drive that kind of lean thinking as an approach, but really scope and careful scope management was something that the very best companies did well. So if these are the things that we know from the market and lots of research and analysis that many companies have done, not just McKinsey, is how to get a change project right, what can we do about it? Well, really what we can do about it is understand the cause of these challenges. Now this comes from a 2018 edition of Best Practices in Change Management, which I quite like, and I've just highlighted in green the reasons behind these top 5 obstacles to successful change management and therefore successful delivery of your business value for the project. I mean, you can read through those, but you get the idea, right? Is that pretty much all of the top reasons that projects struggle, and all projects are change projects, is around people, the resources, the personnel, and making sure you've got the right buy-in, everybody understands each other, and we're all pulling in the same direction to achieve that fantastic business value outcome. But I'd like to, just for fun, explain a little bit about why. You may have heard of some of these reasons before, but I thought it was quite an interesting exploration as to how to achieve business value in a project. Now, you might be aware that us as human beings, everybody on this call, and thank you for attending, by the way, but all of us, we can't help it. This is how we're wired. I've got two ways that we process things in our brains, the way we think. You can see here, Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman referred these to type 1 and type 2, or system 1 and system 2. Okay, so system 1 is what we use all of the time. Every day, this is what we spend most of our time doing as people, and it's fast, intuitive, shortcuts taken, quick thinking. When you're crossing a road or making a decision, eating lunch, choosing to attend a webinar, any of those quick thinking decision makings, you are using system 1. It's very efficient, it's cheap from a processing perspective in our brain, and it's certainly not system 2. System 2 is slow, logical thinking, deliberate cognitive processing. Biologically, it's very expensive. It uses lots of sugars and chemicals and resources in our brain to be able to do that kind of processing. So if we recognize these two types of thinking, we can ask ourselves a question about how do we take these shortcuts in system 1? And I'd just like to show you. So it's called cognitive bias. I'm sure many of you have heard of bias or behavioral bias or cognitive bias. And what it means is really the shortcuts we take to make decisions. So this is quite a famous thing. It's called the Cognitive Bias Codex. And it shows you all 188 biases that we've identified over the last 60 or 70 years as psychologists, whether we're presented with too much information, what shortcuts do our brains take? If we don't really understand what we're seeing, again, what shortcuts do we take? Or even if we need to act fast, what shortcuts do we need to take? And if I was just to show you a few of these, just something called status quo bias, the IKEA effect, and the sunk cost fallacy. Let me just drill into status quo bias, because that's something that really does hinder change projects. You can see here in the description that it is what's called an emotional bias. That means it's hardwired into your brain, and it really is for an emotional reason. And the status quo bias actually comes from ancient times when making a decision to do something different from what we are used to, maybe cross over that hill and walk across the plain and see what's on the other side of the mountain, may actually kill you. So status quo bias is hardwired to make sure that we enjoy and love what we're used to. So if you're going to drive a change project and try to achieve business outcome, stakeholder management and understanding these biases so that we can overcome them is really important. So I'm not going to go through all 188 biases, but what I'm going to do is show you some techniques that we use here at IFS to overcome these challenges, these biases, and perhaps drive that system to more logical, directed thinking. So achieving business outcome and overcoming those change biases, we do in 4 steps. And I'd recommend you do that whether you're inside IFS or outside in a customer or a partner, is to follow these same sort of steps. They're very well tried and tested, and they really do help make sure that people are on board with the change, and you do generally achieve those business outcomes more successfully. So here are the 4 steps. I'm going to take you through those in this presentation today, briefly, not all of them in detail, but to give you an idea of best practice. So underneath each one of these particular types of methodologies, we have some tools that help us achieve them. They're considered the accelerators to make sure that we can explore these 4 things. The first is business value modeling. Let's try and understand a common vision of what we're trying to achieve with the project. What are the KPIs? What are the outcomes? What are the obstacles that might stop us from getting there? And what are the enablers we need to put in place? So we call that a 6-box model. I'll briefly show you that in a moment so you can take that as an example into your own business. Next is a business value assessment. So really understanding the value of change. It's not the value of buying IFS's technology or services from a partner. This is really about understanding the change from your as is to to be and what financial value that would return to you as an organization. From a growing revenue perspective, mitigating costs and mitigating risks. Okay, so growth, risk, cost, the 3 business case types. And it really, if you do it in the way that I'm going to describe and show you in a piece of software, it promotes that leadership buy-in to make sure that everybody wants to achieve this change program and that we overcome some of those biases like the status quo bias. Thirdly is about managing scope. Let's make sure that as we go from that design phase into delivery, that scope is well controlled, defined, managed, and then pursued through any change cycle in a very careful way. Scope is the killer of projects. Many of you have been in projects, I'm sure you've seen the same thing. And lastly is how do we look at the long-term engagement around value inside your deployment environment, inside the customer's environment, to make sure they get the value in an ongoing way. We have to agree as teams, as peers on this call, that go live is not the definition of success. Okay, going live with software is merely a step on the journey towards achieving the business outcomes and the financial returns that are expected from this change project. So those are the 4 steps. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through how you drive a change project. There's quite a famous book called Beyond the Lean Revolution, and I'm going to take you through a version of that change cycle that's considered pretty much best practice. So right at the beginning in that strategy cycle, when you're trying to define and decide what you want to do in the change project, we have to agree what those strategic goals and KPIs are and agree how we're going to engage those stakeholders, the leadership that are going to be involved in the change. As we go round the cycle, understanding the current state and designing the future state. But be careful with understanding the current state. Don't do this in huge amounts of detail. Do this just enough that you understand the journey into that future state. Of course, align it to the enterprise architecture that's already there. There's always a landscape of other applications and processes and systems in a customer environment. We need to make sure that we line that up so that whatever we're doing in the change project fits within those broader projects that we have in place. Of course, then create the transformation plan once you've done that alignment to the enterprise architecture and before you move into implementation and then driving that implementation through the KPIs that you agreed right up front. And of course, that becomes a cycle. Any kinds of changes that happen, you perhaps go around that planning cycle again as quickly as you can. But here is where we differ at IFS from this original change cycle, because we believe that all change projects really should have business value at their very heart. That's why businesses exist in most cases, is to achieve that financial return, and therefore having value at the heart of a change project seems pretty logical. Of course, things change as well. So any short-term corrections in the project, anything that we see a slight scope change, then just make sure that it doesn't damage the business value. And if you can go back from your scope into value, and I'll show you how we do that in a moment, then that's a good thing to check. Is this going to damage the value we expect to get? Long-term corrections, things that are bigger, larger change requests in the program or project, of course, really should go back in through the planning stage and make sure that we don't damage the enterprise in which we're deploying the change. I hope that makes sense. Now, of course, look, there's a huge amount of detail behind this cycle. You can see it on the screen here. I'm not going to walk you through all of that, so don't worry. But the point is, if you take the slides or a screenshot of the slide, these really do represent some of the very best practice in the industry for change projects. And what we've done is we've built a set of accelerators. Remember the McKinsey idea of accelerating your way to success around that change cycle so that we can achieve the outcome as quickly as possible in the most guided way that we can. So I'm just going to briefly show you some of those tools, not all of them, to give you an idea, and of course encourage you to explore with us more as we progress. The 6-box model. Many of the staff here at IFS have seen a 6-box model. If you're in a customer or a partner at the moment, you may not have seen this technique. I'll just briefly walk you through it. we've digitized this. I'm going to show you on a slide, but our preference is to do this in a digital tool that we've written that you'll have access to as part of our business value engagements. So the first box, pretty much in line with what you saw from McKinsey or from that change cycle I just showed you, which is around understanding the strategic business initiatives for this change, for the company in question, who are the owners and what are the KPIs, and then of course stepping through and understanding what's the current landscape, the business and technical operating model, what are you currently doing, and then because of that landscape, what obstacles might get in the way of those strategic initiatives. For those of you who have a background in change projects, you might recognize that what I'm going to be showing you here is in fact something called design thinking, where you look at problem first and bottom the problem out before you then start to solution, something which is really hard for technical people like myself to stop yourself from solutioning too quickly. But this really does help with that process so that everybody understands what we're trying to achieve. Of course, once you've understood the problem, then look at the solution. So where do we go to in the project? What's the future state look like from a technical and a business perspective? What enablers do we need? Of course, we're hoping that that's IFS technology, but it's not just IFS technology in this box. It's the skill sets, education, the budget, the people that need to be involved. So all the stakeholders, it's what are the enablers? What do we need to do to be able to achieve that future landscape? And the last box, I guess, is fairly obvious considering the title of this presentation, and that's you really shouldn't do any change projects unless you understand what the financial case is for that change. What's it going to cost you? How long is it going to take you? And therefore, what are you going to be able to achieve lined up against those strategic objectives and KPIs? So that's a 6-box model. It's great fun to do a 6-box model in your own company because you'll find that you'll never have an agreement straight off the first meeting, but it takes a little while to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and you can consider it a plan on a page. It's very, very powerful. And it does actually start to help with that stakeholder management and overcoming some of the biases of I like what I've got and I will not change, and therefore it's an important step. Next, digital business value assessment, or DBVA as we call it at IFS. So a team inside IFS has written a piece of software, and I'm going to show you that in a brief 3-minute little demo that I recorded. So let's jump into it. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing a templated tool that allows us to rapidly create a business case working with a customer. So you can see what we've done is we've created a set of scope templates for different industries. And if I jump into this example that I'm going to show you, I've got a service-based template here that's been built by the team, and you can see all the individual work activities that you might engage on if you were doing service management, for example. If I click on dispatch, sending an engineer out, what you can see here are the inputs to that work, the outputs, the controls, all the systems, the people, and the KPIs. So we've got a library of KPIs. It's a very large library. In fact, we've also got a library of benchmarks. So if you're working with a client or yourself working on a DBVA and you're unsure about what KPI to use, I encourage you to look at the KPI lists. So let me go back into the scope. This is the scope of activities that a company would do to undertake that activity of doing dispatch or the broad template service management. So here you can see in the template a whole set of already defined benefits. This is what a value engineer would work on. So I talked about dispatch. So I'm going to click on dispatch. And you can see here we've got one example benefit. And if I edit that benefit on your screen, you'll be able to see that this is something we've studied together. And it was around trying to achieve a reduction in overtime. And we can see here that we've got an ability to use some software to change that overtime consumption. And if I just say that I can do it a little bit better, you see a calculation change. And I mentioned this benchmarks. There's a library here of benchmarks. We also use something called APQC, which is one of the world's largest libraries of benchmarks. It really does help our customers understand what the art of the possible, what could be achieved. So just again here, dispatch. I made a little change there in the numbers, and we've used some base data here to help do the mathematics, cost of engineers, the number of engineers that are on site or available to the company, And we go through and do that work for every single type of activity you saw in that template. And that lets us do some comparisons. So you can look at the values by activity, what the improvements are. I could do an as is to to be in the tool and say, well, if we make these changes, use technology to help us improve those different areas, this is my as is to be cost analysis. Now, of course, as a tool, there's a database behind this, so I could look at the business case over time. So if I go down and click on dispatch, the change that I made just a moment ago, you can see here in the business case. These are just numbers, right? So the moment I've done that work and completed that exercise, I can, of course, click on the business case button and see a full multi-year business case with customers' costs, IFS's costs, partner costs. And then we can look at the net present value, the internal rate of return. I can apply some risks to this. I can look at a ramped return model. And if you didn't want to see that in an IFS tool, we could, of course, export it into Power BI. So I've just logged into Power BI here, and you can see scheduling and dispatch. If I drill through to the benefits there, you can see the improvements and how we've done the calculation and the change that I just made to that business case. Now, of course, I've shown that to you super quickly, but the takeaway from this is that we have a set of templated swim lane activity-based offerings for each of the industries we work in, with a set of sample data, sample benefits. But of course, we can add to those as we engage with the client to be able to do a value-based project. So that's the DBVA tool. But it doesn't just stop at the digital business value assessment tool. We want to take it further than that. So we've done our DBVA, and it's a work that can take a week or even a few months, depending on the scope. We don't want to overscope it and do too much. It needs to be indicative enough to understand the value for the customer of doing this project. But remember, one of the big pushbacks from McKinsey, or the big ideas from McKinsey, is to make sure that we manage the project really, really well, and that we understand scope and scope management. So IFS as a company has had IFS Scope tool for quite a long time, and it really is quite a brilliant tool if you use it and use it well, but we are trying to make it better by connecting it to the value assessment as we progress with our clients. So here you can see the Scope tool, and I'll briefly show it to you if you haven't seen it before in just a moment. But the scope that comes out of Scope tool, if it's done very well, is detailed enough that you can do things like take a technology partner, like we have ClickLearn for IFS Cloud, that allows us to take that scope, feed it into ClickLearn, and to a greater or lesser extent, automatically generate training content based on roles and based on the scope inside Scope tool. Of course, we use Scope tool to run the projects and get a dashboard view of what's being done in the delivery process. But wouldn't it be awesome if we could connect the DBVA and the Scope tool together and start managing scope with value represented in the scope? And that is absolutely something that we've now done with a number of clients here at IFS, with some very clever delivery consultants and value engineers stitching these two things together. That's a bit of a longer session to show you that, but it's a very powerful capability. Let me just briefly show you Scope tool if you haven't seen it before. It's not designed to look pretty, but it is designed to be functional. And what you'll see is that we have captured the scope of capability of IFS's entire product, into Scope tools. Everything that you can do with IFS's product, whether that's raising a purchase requisition or filling out general ledger, all of those scoped capabilities, functional business capabilities, have been mapped into IFS Scope tool. Let's just have a little look at IFS Scope tool. So here you can see this company, Acme. I've just got a few things in scope. And one of the things that I might want to do is to say being able to support purchase requisitions. So I've clicked on the purchase requisition. This is behind the scenes, the flow through the product. This is not what a customer or an end user would see. You can see here 4 different types of purchase requisitions. If I was to click on one, this is the flow through the software of raising that type of purchase requisition, that particular way of functioning. Now, what we've done as a company is we've created something we call a pre-burner. And a pre-burner lets us really scope down rather than scope up with a solution. All of the functional capabilities, and then work with the customer to understand what is needed to fit the value that we're trying to pursue with that change project. Okay, so what are we trying to achieve with the change project? What journey we're going on to our 2B? What landscape do we need it to be? And then what functional capability in IFS do we need to bring to bear to meet that change requirement? Scope tool is fantastic at allowing us to deliver that. And as I said, we've got a number of projects now where we've stitched the digital business value statements into Scope tool and represent them within Scope so that we understand what the value of the work that's being delivered gives back to the customer. And that really does connect those two things together. It's very powerful. But it doesn't quite stop there either. Because in change projects, one of the most important things to do is to make sure that we close the gap to the end users. So we really need to make sure that the end users themselves are carefully managed and managing their work, but understanding the impact on KPIs that their work has. Maybe you do that at a management level or a head of line of business level, but you really should be starting to drive KPIs. So some brilliant work was done at IFS to make sure that we could represent IFS in IFS Cloud, something we call Central. So IFS Central is really a representation of all of the functional capabilities that we bring to bear in the product, but with KPIs layered over as dashboard-driven engagement models. So I'll briefly show you that just so you get an idea of what it looks like. So here I've logged into IFS Cloud, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill into our Central, and you can see here all of the dashboards that are available. I'm showing you way more than you would normally see. So let me pick into one industry and sub-industry. So here it's discrete manufacturing. You can see a bunch of business processes and supporting processes. I'm going to click into CRM, and now you see these KPIs across the top. Of course, I can still do my work, so I can go in and start managing my leads in the CRM system, as you can see here. But I can also go back and look at the KPIs. So there's just one example KPI in the system that's calculated as part of viewing what really is going on in my system. Now, those KPIs, if you're carefully designing a value-based change process, the KPIs will roll up to those large KPIs we talked about right at the beginning when we talked about stakeholder management strategy and those KPIs that McKinsey recommended right at the beginning. So now we've closed that loop. We've gone from the original business value work, what's the point of doing the change project, defining the KPIs and the as is to 2B, into scope and scoping by value, into delivery, and then an end user managing their environments using KPIs to help track things. Closing that loop that I showed you right at the beginning to make sure that you're always supporting the value of the project from the very beginning, to make sure you're not a statistic in the next McKinsey study. So why don't we close all of that out with a graphic just to represent the process I've just taken you through very quickly, because I wanted to give time for any questions in the chat or to give you a little bit of time back in your day. So we start with that anticipation, building products and portfolio of services that you would want to use as a customer. And that's something that if you do this work in a collaborative way, make sure that we understand what value is obtained from any of these change projects, then the products that we build at IFS become more directed at the value the customers in our industries receive. So it becomes virtuous understanding the value. Next, the 6-box model. Again, we've digitized this, and I would encourage you to use the IFS DBVA to build your 6-box models, because you can then take those 6-box models and the numbers in the 6-box models and push them into something we call a success plan at the end, which I'll mention in a moment. I've shown you how you can really start to understand the scope of change from a value perspective using a template industry-based model inside our DBVA. I've shown you just a very small fraction of the capability there that the team have built into that product. It's a multi-tenanted solution, secure, hosted in Microsoft Azure, which really does give you the opportunity to engage with IFS, a value engineer, and the sales team to use this and explore the value of the change project yourself. Fourthly, Scope Tool. Again, showed you very quickly what Scope Tool brings, but the ability to scope down and make sure that you get everything that you need from the capability of the product, and then align that to the value from the DBVA, really does let you scope and deliver the most valuable things as best as you can, and look for those conflicts so that you deliver things in the right order. Lastly, of course, I showed you IFS Cloud and how using KPI-driven dashboards really helps you bring back from the original design of your 6-box model and the business case to make sure that you manage those KPIs in a way that ensures you stick to the value over time. And what you'll see underneath here is something we call IFS Success. To make our customers advocates, not just references, but people who will advocate for IFS as a company and a platform, they really need to understand the impact that our products have had on their business in an ongoing way, and make sure that we can help them achieve those values in a long-term engagement. So IFS Success is a premium engagement we offer to our clients on top of that implementation work that's maybe done by ourselves or by our partners, to get that long tail value-based piece of work to ensure ongoing success in their business change projects. So that really is the end-to-end process, because of course, once you've achieved that change project, you should probably make sure that you're going back around the loop to make sure you're ahead of your competition, because change is inevitable. Once you embrace it as a way of working and a way of living, you really will stay ahead of the competition. But doing it in this templated, controlled way really does make sure that you don't waste any time or effort or make mistakes in communication with all parties that are involved in the project. So with that, I've given you 35 minutes of a presentation. You can find out more if you're external to IFS by going to ifs.com/company/about-ifs/business-value. You can see it on the screen there, and that'll take you through some of the things that I've just shown. Or please reach out and engage with your local teams, or indeed connect with me on LinkedIn and reach out, and I'll either work with you or connect you to the right people as we pursue the bright, valuable future you have ahead of yourself from a change project perspective, but always sticking to that mantra of it's only worth doing if it generates business value. Okay, with that, thank you for your attention, and I will see if there are any questions to take. The session's been recorded, so please share it with your colleagues. And Phil, if you want to see whether there's any questions for me.
Hi, Matt. Yes, there aren't any questions at present. So you must have done an incredible job, or people are too... Oh, I can't... Kristen says there's one, I can't see it. Kristen, can you jump in here, because I can't see it.
Apologies, sorry. There is one just came in. So it says, great presentation, Matt. One question, how do you connect back the results to the BVA? Do you use a baseline analysis of KPIs?
So that's a good point. So what we do in our DBVA tool is we've got different states that we can record the values in, from kind of estimated or guesstimated, if you like, based on benchmarks, all the way through to verified. So the idea in the long term with IFS is that we capture those business benefits, verify them through the success engagements that we deliver, and then roll those numbers back into the baselines. The baselines we have at the moment in the tool are either from existing projects that we've done with customers where we did some retrospective analysis, or from a company called IDC who did some analysis on a whole bunch of our customers for us with their permission. And if you're a customer on this call, thanks for letting us do some of that. Or from an industry library of benchmarks that have been peer reviewed across many, many companies that we pay a fee to subscribe to, that we can then use in our studies to see whether we can baseline those benchmarks against the results that we get. Does that make sense for the person who asked the question, I hope? I guess the important point here that's great for us as a company is that over time this becomes effectively self-reinforcing, because the more people that engage with this, and the more people that do success projects where we measure those values, the more sure those customers can be that they're achieving the benchmarks that put them in the upper quartile of performance. They're their very best performers. If you want to know how well this is going inside IFS, from that question, we've done now, I think it's 312 digital business value assessments with customers, and we're into the low 90s of IFS success engagements, and there are nearly 6,000 individual benefit line items like the one I showed you in the DBVA, listed across all of the industries we serve now. You see some spikes in some of the industries that we do more work in, but generally speaking, we now have data and value line items for every single industry, and in fact many hundreds and thousands of those now in some cases, up to just shy of 6,000 benefit items. So it becomes a self-supporting capability and tool that benefits all of the users of this methodology. Cool. Any other questions?
There actually are just a couple more.
Sure.
Is there a course in the academy for the DBVE tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is. Actually there's a number of courses, so both available as partners to our customers, but mostly to our staff and our partners. And there's something called the BVE Fundamentals. So if you go into Academy and search for BVE Fundamentals, that gives you all of the base understanding, the language that you need to understand when you're doing business case or business value work. Things like, what is a net present value? What is a weighted average cost of capital? And why is it important to every company on the planet, whether they're private or public, it doesn't matter. So once you've done that, there's also a set of courses on the DBVA tool itself that I've just shown you. It does become fairly self-intuitive. It takes a few hours to learn it, but going through those courses really does help. There's also material about the psychology of change available, and it really does make sure, I really would recommend you go through some of this training. If you're an IFS employee, you can find an awful lot more underneath the IFS Essentials training and academy as well, where we talk about the methodologies that I've just gone through. Great question.
So related to that, there's another one around regarding change management. There's a lot of literature that's both less and more, sciencey, quote unquote. Do you have some time to share maybe your list of favorites in the community, things that would be a great read?
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of material. Actually, if you're inside IFS or in a partner, and we can help connect you to some of that material, because we've actually collected it up into quite a large presentation that I give when I do training on this subject that lasts a day or two. So yes, we can come back to what's my favorites. A lot of this is something that we've spent, a team of us that have worked together for a number of companies and now here at IFS for the last 20 years, gathering together and looking at that research, because there's really many decades worth of behavioral science and change science research, to try and draw it all into something that's a bit more manageable, rather than saying go and spend 20 years doing research. I would never suggest that unless you were super interested. And what we've done is distilled that down to the subjects that really matter. So motivation theory, change theory, human bias, and managing those things. A lot of the tools I've just shown you really do use those behavioral techniques behind the scenes. So you don't actually need to know the behavioral science. If you use the techniques, it causes you to use the behavioral science. But yes, if you're interested in the science itself, it's truly fascinating, both from a personal growth perspective, helping your career, in fact, interacting with any human being on the planet, not just in a business context, but out into a personal context. It's been one of the most fascinating things that I've done in my career, and really helped change who I am as a technical guy in applying change in customers with technology to achieve outcomes that matter and make sense to the people that are doing them. Yeah, I encourage you to reach out, or if you're inside IFS, lean into the business value engineering community that we've got inside Workplace.
Great, thank you. Just a couple more, one being around, do you have any advice on how we make sure people use the scope tool, and how to make sure that they know how to use these tools?
Yeah, so I mean that's probably a tough, simple answer to that question. The challenge with all of these sorts of tools and techniques is that using them on the surface is easy, right? It's not that difficult, but using them in depth, in ways that enhance change, that requires some experience. So Scope Tool really make sure that the team that you're engaged with, the pre-sales folk and the sales folk, are doing the precursors necessary to help make the Scope Tool work not easy, but more achievable in a time frame that makes sense. So really involving the delivery personnel, whether that's from a partner or from IFS, by involving them a little bit earlier where it makes sense, so that we don't ruin their day from their delivery perspective, but making sure that you bring these two groups together, sales, pre-sales and delivery, so that you understand the 6-box modeling that I've showed you, the as is to be, the journey into the value and what's most valuable to deliver and where are the benefits located. And the digital BVA, the BVA tool that I've shown you, no surprise, the swim lanes, I went through it super quick. All those swim lanes that you saw are actually lined up to IFS's capability as a cloud platform. So there is a journey here that's quite well orchestrated. So if the teams don't do those early bits, Scope Tool's harder. So making sure that we hold each other to account and our customers hold us to account as well, that we do that work from change perspective through into scope and Scope Tool management, using the templates as we can into delivery. And training is available for these tools, as I mentioned, on Academy. But as I said, experience matters. So reaching out to colleagues that have used these tools, of which there is a large community. If you look at Scope Tool, for example, it's now over 1,000 projects globally have been through Scope Tool. There's a lot of experience. So reach out to your more experienced colleagues and ask them to help understand the precursors and the detail that's necessary to get the very best out of the tools. What I would say though is please do not avoid them. Do not avoid these tools. They're proven to improve our delivery capability and our outcomes and success. There is a one-to-one correlation between successful projects and using things like the IFS Success Premium Engagement Service, for example. So we're seeing that when you take these services as a customer, outcome is much more assured, which is why I guess I call it business value assurance, is you're assuring those outcomes. Do the training, reach out to experienced colleagues, but please make sure that we use them. I encourage you to press people into making sure we are using them. They're not perfect, of course, but how else are you going to do it? PowerPoint and spreadsheets is not the answer. We need a living, breathing tool or capability, that's what digitization is, a platform on which change is built for our customers and our partners. Good question, thank you for that one.
We have another one that's similarly related is, in regards to these activities, how much of this really is starting in the implementation process? So how early on do these things come into play?
Well, golly, that's an excellent question. I would encourage anybody that goes through any kind of change projects that you start using these techniques at the very, very beginning, almost before the project's even a twinkle in the eye of a project manager, so to speak. When you do this kind of analysis work up front, it's quick, fast. You know, I'm not talking about analysis paralysis here, but doing 6-box models with our customers, or if you are a customer on this call or a partner on this call, do them on your own. You know, do the 6-box models. I've done hundreds of them in my career. I promise you will have arguments in the team, even if the vendor's not there or the partner's not there. You will uncover a lot of disagreement, a lot of misunderstanding or uncertainty about any kind of project or change program. So do it early, do it consistently, but do it digitally. Don't just write it down in a notebook. Do it in a way that can be shared. There are other tools rather than just like the 6-box model I've shown you here from IFS. Use an online whiteboards, mirror boards. You know, there's lots of different tools out there to help you with team collaboration that let things be captured digitally. And that digital capture lets you start to track and trace these KPIs and agreements so that the communication is flawless from start to end rather. You've really got to have that flow of reasoning Yeah, that system 2 thinking as to why you're doing what you're doing and how you're going to do it in a consistent, well-managed way. Don't do change unless you understand why you're doing the change. Yeah, do it early. Good question.
If there is, this one kind of relates to the same thing, if there's any kind of pushback on this, what do you feel about the best arguments on how to prove that the DBVA tool is worth the customer's time?
Yeah, and you're going to get pushback. In my experience, I've been doing this about 20 years. I'd say about 50% of the time, half the time, you get quite significant pushback. There's two kinds of pushback. One of them, which is often when you're involved late, you're in a late stage to the change project. Maybe you're from a customer perspective, maybe you're about to send out RFPs, RFQs, those sorts of things. That's quite late in a change project, really. So the pushback there is, I don't want to share the numbers. I think it would disadvantage us as a customer to share those numbers with vendors and partners, because you might use it to negotiate more with me than not you would be otherwise. So I think there's that kind of pushback. The second kind of pushback is a little different, and that's more quite often because, let's be truthful about it, as a customer, you may not actually understand these numbers or record them, and you may be a little bit unsure about whether you want them exposed internally. So in all cases where there's pushback, I think find out why, but then really challenge people as to how are they going to run a successful change project that delivers value and doesn't do what McKinsey say that you shouldn't do. So point to the McKinsey report or to other reports very similar to that and say, look, this is the reality. If you don't manage these things and manage them well, this is everybody. This is the whole field of IT change projects. This is the bell curve. Maybe you'll be lucky and you'll be on the far right of the bell curve, but that's together with only 1 or 2% of change projects in the industry. Doesn't matter whether it's IFS or anybody else. So I guess explain why. And if there's still pushback, honestly, I still do a lot of this work personally when I do value engineering in my role, amongst other things that I do, and share it anyway. Say, oh, I know you don't want it. We've done an outside in. This is what it looks like. It's surprising after you've asked maybe the 4th or 5th or 6th time to be tenacious, that you'll find that those people start to become receptive as they realize that it provides much more rigor and discipline. Sometimes, though, to be blunt, people are not going to want to do this work. I still encourage you to do it behind the scenes because it'll help defend your position if there's challenge later on as to why you want to do something, why you want to use technology in a certain way, because you'll then at least know from your perspective why you want to do this. But this is about creating collaboration. Sometimes I explain to customers about trust building and how vendor customer relationships can be damaged if you end up with that finger pointing of, well, you said this and I said that. So why don't we try and act more as a team and collaborate together? At the end of the day, it's not IFS's change project, it's the customers. So we're really just trying to help them on their journey to success. So explaining the reasons why, explaining the science. I've done a few customer workshops this week myself in front of IFS customers, some new customers and 2 existing customers, where we've gone through this process in quite some detail and talked to them about collaboration and trust building and making sure that we all hold each other to account to the successful projects, not just the vendors held to account or the customer or the partner, if that makes sense, right? Collaboration and trust is an essential part of any change project and journey. If you miss those out or they break, it's the route to just an unsuccessful engagement and everyone gets unhappy. Any other questions?
Great. Thank you, Matt. There is one last question that would be, where can we get a DBVA template? Does that exist somewhere?
So the DBVA tool itself, there's a set of scope templates built into the tool. So you'll find those if you want to work with the DBVA tool, or indeed reach out to a business value engineer. We've got quite a large number of value engineers or people who are familiar with value engineering in the pre-sales team, for example. And there's also regional leads inside IFS for value engineering, and they can help you with access to the templates and the tool. It's something that we provide as an availability to anybody that wants it. We've got quite a few partners using it already. We've even got quite a few customers that have taken the tool from us as part of the engagement and then done their own onward work inside the tool without IFS's help, as they've learned it and use it to help manage that change process and to do some of the business value work. It's a very powerful, flexible tool, and the templates are pretty much built in. Any trouble, reach out to your value engineers. Okay, excellent. Well, if there's no more questions, wonderful. Thank you for those lovely attendees that stayed for the questions and gave me lots of lovely questions. That's what makes these sorts of presentations much more successful than somebody like me just showing a load of PowerPoints and some software, is when you take the time to join in with the questions. And if you put a question in the chat and I managed to answer it and you were okay with the answer, then wonderful. If I was on YouTube, I'd be saying subscribe, like, give me thumbs up. But here I'm just saying it'd be great if you attend the next webinar from perhaps one of my other colleagues that does the next session, and offer them the same sort of great questions that you've done for me. Otherwise, when you get to your weekend, have a fantastic weekend, and appreciate you attending this webinar.
That's brilliant, Matt. Thank you ever so much, and what a fantastic turnout and great questions. I'll wrap this up now. Thank you very much for attending today's session. The session has been recorded and we'll share the link as soon as possible. Please do join us on the 25th of March for our next office hours with Tom Gregory for an introduction to IFS customer experience. Again, thank you very much, Matt. Take care, everyone, and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.